Let's talk about mixing subtle color shifts for painting without making a mess of your painting and your palette. I got this nice submission from Alan, and he asked, what should I take note of when choosing colors in relation to their values? First, let's separate our palette by light and shadow. And I've mixed these colors for each object: flesh tones, hair, lips, and background. I'll just show you the flesh tones for now, and I'm trying to stay within a few parameters here. Generally, all your light shades should be brighter and more saturated because more light equals more color. You don't always have to stay within those parameters, but you won't go wrong if you do. And we can also ask if the lights are warmer or cooler than the shadows. Do they lean more towards orange or more towards blue? Now, the lights are overexposed, so we don't have a lot to go with here, but looking right here, I can see more of an orange in the shadows, but not over here. The light is directly hitting her arm and then bouncing into that shadow, giving it warmth. So that tells me the light is warm. Now, when I say warm, I'm speaking in relative terms. This is warmer than this, but this makes everything look cool. So these lights are warm relative to what? To their shadows, and in this case, only barely. Let me pull you away to look at an extreme example. We've got a warm yellow light with cool purple shadows. If all we cared about was values, we could just mix these two colors together at different ratios to achieve a value scale. But take a look at this. This sphere feels way more alive with color. So the nature of light is that it maintains its saturation and temperature right up until it meets the shadow. The values are getting darker, but the colors are staying rich. Coming back to this, we can see the same principle at work, only more subtle. You can see it in the image here. Look at this nice hint of red in here. It's both warmer and more colorful than the brighter light next to it and the shadows on the other side. So you could say that the most saturation and warmth could be found right here. And then the colors get just a little cooler. They become less orange and more pink. If they stayed yellow-orange, it'd look like this. So within the lights, they go from warmer to just a little cooler. But I still want the lights as a whole to be warmer than the shadows. Everything is relative. I'm being very careful to stay close to the structure. I don't want to deviate outside of these principles unintentionally. And look at these two shades separating light and shadow. They are barely different in value, but look at how the color drops in the shadow. These close values will help make soft gradients, but the drop in color will maintain a clear distinction between the light and shadow. And we're already capturing some subtle color shifts that are happening in the overall impression. Super important. And Alan, I think you did a great job with this. I just needed to explain that to make sure that we're on the same page. In this study, I struggled the most on maintaining a value hierarchy while also having colors that didn't appear dull or lifeless. This is a great problem to struggle with. I'll start with a process and then give more advice. Imagine that this color is at the center of a color wheel. What would happen if you added a little blue or a little yellow or green? When people talk about temperature shifts, this is what they're talking about. These subtle variations in hue, and they're all connected to a shade that serves as an approximation for all of them. In other words, this value suffices by itself, but it would come alive with all these additional colors. Now, when I look at this face, I see green in here. Now, it's not actually green, but relative to this, there's more green. If you don't see it, that's okay. Just keep painting and mixing colors, and eventually you will. Theory alone won't take you there. You have to train your eyes to see through practice. But as I look around, I'm seeing some greens. And the next question you need to ask is, what value is it? This shade comes from here, and I see a little green next to it. The value hasn't changed. So I'll take some of this shade and then push it slightly towards green. And I'll repeat the process. I see some green in here, but what value is it? This value is actually closer to this one, so I'll take this shade and then push that towards green. This one as well. If I see that change in color, what value is it? That's the question. I don't want to get that value wrong. Values are way more important than color. I'm also seeing some reds and some golden yellows. I'm trying to keep the value the same, but the hue is different. I'm even seeing a little gray purple in here. I'll just put that to the side. And we also have this bright reflection here, which is about the same value as my darkest light, but I'm okay to make an exception. Now, on a traditional painting palette, I would separate these colors more like this so that I don't get contamination. And usually I'll focus more on temperature shifts in the light, but in this case, the image is overexposed, so the bulk of the work is in the shadows. So now we have all these colors to work with, and we've stayed inside of the overarching parameters. It's okay to go outside them, but do so thoughtfully. And speaking of which, there are a few colors unaccounted for. Look at how vivid this color is. It's technically a shadow, but our flesh is translucent, so the light is shining through it. It's a little bit harder to determine if it's a light or shadow, but it's certainly colorful. It's also in the lips, it's in the hair. So I would mix a separate string of colors until it reconnects back to the main string. I'm treating these differently because the light is interacting with it differently. The light is determining everything. I don't know why I never get tired of that. Even these temperature shifts are being determined by the light, and I'll talk about that in a later video. But how do you maintain the value hierarchy while also keeping your colors full of life? What's really important is maintaining a harmony. Remember, everything is relative. If I feel like my colors are dull and lifeless, I'm not necessarily going to solve the problem by just throwing on some hits of red in a random location, because it's throwing off the relationships. But this is why I started with that overall impression. We know that the most colorful areas are going to be where the light's about to touch the shadow, where there's reflections, where there's translucence. It's only when you create a contradiction in the harmony, it'll start to look really wrong. Like if you're going to make this reflection colorful, how come you didn't also increase the saturation of those translucents so that the translucents will always have the most vivid colors? As long as you aren't creating contradictions in the relationships, you can play around. And I know this isn't easy, but you really have to juggle these kinds of parameters. This is my most vivid color. This is my most yellow color, my most whatever. This area is going to be the dullest spot in the painting. Having some of those parameters will help you find the space that you have to play. And you might find that you may take some of these reflections and decide, you know what, I'm going to push this. I'm going to like increase this way up here. I'm not going to get so crazy that it's going to look translucent, but I'm going to push it really up. And then now that might force me to push everything a little bit as well, because you're trying to maintain the relationships. You could kind of push the painting into all these different directions. As long as you maintain those relationships, the sky's the limit. And that's just realism. You could intentionally break some of those relationships just to make a point, but you'd want to do so intentionally. So I've just been playing around on top of this painting, and while still staying inside of my parameters, I was able to bring a lot of life. I've even moved the relationships around a little bit. I increased the saturation on this. Now let's say that I feel like some of my shadows are a little too gray. I've got this gray in here, I've got some grays kind of in here. Now they do help create a relationship. This looks nice and warm compared to this, and this looks warm compared to that. But if I feel like the shadows overall are not colorful enough, well, it doesn't seem like adding more color in here is going to do it. So why don't I just globally change all of the colors of the shadows? A lot of the colors look more similar to each other, which I'm okay with. So now this is still here, but it's a little bit more subtle. But what's happening on a global level is that now it's very clear that these shadows are kind of this reddish pink compared to the background. Before, the shadows were a lot more connected, and maybe that's what you want. But this is just an example of how I'm manipulating relationships to create the impression I want. But let's pretend that we're still setting up our palette. We have not started painting yet. How you paint corresponds directly to your palette. If you paint more directly, where you lay the right color and shade in the right spot, then this palette will work nicely. But if you instead put the base shades down first and then want to add temperature shifts on top while it's still wet, you'll need to make your temperature shifts less subtle than what I created, because those colors will mix into each other on your painting. If you're new to temperature shifts, I'd recommend the former, painting more directly and putting each shade where it belongs. But if you want to paint more loosely and quickly, then you'll prefer the latter method. Just know that it's a lot easier to lose your value structure when doing it this way, so it's more complex and intuitive. And from here, the next question is, where do I put my color shifts? Is it as simple as copying the colors I see? Well, it might be, but there are some helpful things that you can focus on that will give you more direction and structure, and I'll cover that in the next video. Alan also asked about darker values in the skin, and I find that you can stay pretty colorful. I feel like the amount of saturation in the shadows doesn't really change. At least I'm not seeing it in this one. So let your dark values do the work of conveying form, but then keep the color to retain a luminous feeling in those skin tones. My main goal isn't photorealism, but rather getting to a place where I can confidently say something new about the reference or any painting. And that's an awesome goal to have, Alan. I don't want you to be a copying machine. I want you to be able to paint with understanding so that you can create whatever it is that you envision. And to do that, I'm looking at core principles that can be applied to any kind of painting or drawing. And if you found these explanations helpful, please let me know in the comments. I'm still figuring out how to best teach this, so your feedback would be appreciated. Let me know also what you'd like to learn, what you'd like to be broken down and explained and given a process to. It'd be cool to interact with you guys a little bit more and give you guys what you need. And in the meantime, you can submit your art for a critique, and I'll keep this train going for now. Happy painting, everyone.